My son, his head was swollen out. He's bruised all over his body. And she just blurts out, "I'm going to jail." I knew that she had something to do with my son's death.
Around 3:20 p.m. on September the 12th, 2019, Officers Henson and Kivett with the Asheboro Police Department arrived at 711 South Church Street. When the officers entered Apartment A, they discovered the body of 33-year-old Brandon Embry lying on the concrete floor near the bedroom door. Bruises and lacerations covered his body, while blood stained the walls, floors, and sheets throughout the apartment. Brandon's battered, broken body was eventually taken to Moses Cone Hospital in Greensboro, where he passed away on September the 13th at 8:57 p.m. Detective Lori Johnson initially suspected that Brandon had beaten himself to death while high on meth until the toxicology came back clean, except for a non-lethal amount of Benadryl. After also being blamed on synthetic marijuana, despite none being found in the apartment, the coroner ruled that Brandon had died due to pneumonia and an enlarged heart. Medical examiner Dr. Lauren Scott claimed the injuries were self-inflicted based on the opinion that there was not a large amount of blood at the scene. On February the 7th, 2020, the medical examiner will amend the autopsy determination to undetermined. 20 days later, on February 27th, Brandon's parents are brought in so the case can be closed against their wishes. While this is the official narrative, there are many who have genuine doubts. One of the most ardent and persistent opponents of the official narrative is Brandon Embry's mother, Sarah Lee, who has gone on a relentless journey to uncover the truth.
Hi, I'm Sarah Lee. My son was Brandon Embry, and I'm a mother who's been fighting for justice for my son, who was murdered September of 2019, and just trying to get to truth and answers.
Sarah became concerned about Brandon after being unable to reach him and receiving a concerning text on September the 10th around 6:30 a.m. saying, "I can't do this again. I looked around. I can't even get a personal loan." After several unreturned calls, Sarah decides to visit in person.
The day leading up to the discovery, my son had traveled for work. He had been in Detroit, and the project ended early. He had come home, and I asked him to dog sit for me. I had to go on a trip to pick up his sister, and she was in Kentucky. And so he had come over that Friday, September 6th, and that was the last day that I saw him. He had been let go from his job that day, but his demeanor, he was laughing, he was happy to see the dogs. He was in a good mood. So since I was driving and I was driving through the mountains, I didn't talk to him a whole lot. So just kind of touched base here and there. And then when we got home that Saturday, that was his birthday. And we were kind of disappointed that when we got home, he had already left. He hadn't seen his sister in several months, so she was anxious to see him. And it was kind of strange that I called him back about the thermostat, and I called like 3 times and he never answered. And I thought that was kind of strange because he would usually answer the phone. I had tried to get a hold of him, and I hadn't talked to him actually since that Friday before. And I just felt like something was off, something wasn't right. I couldn't understand why he wasn't answering the phone. Then I guess it was like Thursday that I ended up going over to his apartment because he hadn't answered any of my calls. We were knocking on the door, the back door, rapping on the windows. I was calling his name through the window, and there was no answer, but both of his vehicles were right out front at his apartment. And I didn't know of him going anywhere. So I thought, well, he should be in there, but he's not answering. So that's when we called 911. And they had someone from the property management office come over and unlock the door. And the first responders went in, and then the ambulance came, and the EMS brought him out on the gurney, but they pulled me away. So I really didn't get to see him up close or get a chance to talk to him or anything like that. And all I could really see is the sheet was pulled up to his neck, and he had like the oxygen mask on. And so they went to the hospital, and we drove behind. It was only about a mile away, probably even less than that. And it was hours. There were many hours that passed by before we actually got to go back and see Brandon.
Brandon's condition did not improve, leaving Sarah facing any parent's worst nightmare.
They kept using the word sick. They kept saying he's very sick as an alternative word to critical. And the doctor, when we did finally go back, he told me that his organs were shutting down, that his kidneys were breaking down, and that it did not look good, and that he didn't think that Brandon was going to make it. It was just so shocking. When they let us go back to see him and he had been intubated, I kept thinking about just 7 months prior that he had been intubated before, and and then he came out fine. So I think this part of us, even though they kept saying that he was very sick and he wasn't going to make it, Brandon was so strong, and we just felt like, maybe they were wrong and maybe he was going to pull through. It was just shocking. As a mother, it's just so hard. I mean, I just remember saying, I wish there was a way that, he could live on and take me instead or something. It's the hardest thing as a parent to lose a child.
Under normal circumstances, the grieving process would begin, but this case was anything but normal. During the autopsy 3 days later, a theory was put forward by Detective Lori Johnson, who suggested that Brandon had overdosed on meth before going crazy and beating himself to death. To test the claim, a 2,000-panel toxicology screening was ordered. Detective Johnson's half-baked theory would be shot to pieces when the toxicology was clear besides Benadryl. A few days later, Sarah would return to apartment A. What she had discovered inside the apartment would further fuel her suspicions. Sarah made sure to take pictures of the potential crime scene, knowing that evidence could be invaluable in the future.
At first I didn't go in. My husband and my daughter were really concerned for me to go because they kept saying there was a lot of blood around the apartment. And, I was feeling that I needed to go and see what they were doing with my son's things, what the situation was. And so I went in the apartment, and mostly when I went into the entryway was just where they were boxing up all of his belongings. But then when I went into the bedroom, the first thing that I see is the big pool of blood from where he had been laying. I saw blood on the walls. I saw where they had done some measurements for the blood. But it's when I went in the bathroom that I just, everything that I took in, I was like looking at the walls, and I could see where it looked like the walls had been washed off, that there had been blood on the walls, but there was like water dripping through it. The shower curtain, the shower rod was gone. The toilet was pulled up off of the floor and away from the wall. The mirror was broken. The mirror had blood and it looked like cleanser or something dripping through. Just a very bad sense of something very bad had happened in the bathroom. And I just really had that impression Brandon had been fighting for his life. And when we saw this blood and how it looked like it had been washed off, that's when I told my husband, I said, you need to call the detectives back over here to have a look at this. So Detective Sudduth, who was supposed to be the lead on Brandon's case, came, and then Johnson came. And one of the remarks that she made that later my husband and I thought was very strange was that she made it a point to tell us that she was only the driver for CID to the autopsy. And, then we talked about, okay, the blood. My husband took Sudduth all through the apartment. There was blood spatter close to the ceiling in the bedroom on the far wall. And he just pointed, my husband had pointed out blood everywhere inside the closet, which later when we get the crime scene photos, they hadn't even really taken some of the blood spatter that had been on the closet doors and inside the closet. But the main point was that I was really stuck on, it looks like this blood had been partially washed off of the walls. And Johnson said that that's what people do when they're on meth. And then she said that Brandon was taking meth and put all those injuries on himself. And my husband and I were just in disbelief. We couldn't believe that this was her theory, that she was saying things like this.
Out of the blue, the investigation would take an unexpected turn when a female named Cassandra contacted Sarah's daughter-in-law through Facebook, saying, "Hey, I know you don't know me at all, but I was your brother's girlfriend." She claims she found out the hard way when she went to Brandon's apartment and learned about his passing. Although Sarah contacts her back on the 19th, Cassandra won't respond for more than a week. On September the 27th, Cassandra responds and strikes up a conversation with Sarah, who begins learning a lot about Brandon's supposed girlfriend. She claims she is Brandon's girlfriend from the beginning of April, although she met him in January on a dating app. According to Cassandra, they had discussed the possibility of marriage. Sarah and Cassandra eventually agreed to meet, and that initial meeting would prove to be an eye-opening experience for Brandon Embry's mother.
I first met Cassandra. It was her suggestion that we meet for lunch, and so we end up first going to Dunkin' Donuts in Asheboro, and I pulled up and I called her, and she said, I'm over here at the white Jeep. And so we got out, I walked up to her, and the first thing that I noticed is that she was shaking. She was shaking more than anyone that I had ever met, and thought that was really strange. We went in, we got coffee, we sat down, and the other thing that I thought was very odd was the way that she just kind of stared at me. And at first I thought maybe it was because, Brandon looked like me, or because I was crying. I was trying to think of a logical explanation of why she was just sitting so still and just staring at me. Later, I learned that there's something called a psychopathic stare, and that is really, that's how I would describe it. How they described the psychopathic stare is how I felt she was looking at me. She didn't say a whole lot, but it was, to me, it was nice to have someone just sit there and talk about Brandon. So, it was an odd meeting, but at the same time, I was glad to get to talk about my son. From the coffee, then we went over to have lunch at the Mexican restaurant, and she had a drink, and I think that made her feel a little more comfortable, and she started talking, and she said some things that just were so off-putting, and later I had discussed it with people that, after considering everything that had happened with Brandon, she said things like they had bought a blender in Walmart and they weren't charged for it. And then she said that they got away with murder. And I just thought it was such an odd turn of phrase considering everything. And then she told me that she was divorced, and she said that she caught her husband cheating on her, and she caught him in bed with another woman, and she made the comment that she could have killed him. But it was the way that she said it. It was just such an icy, cold demeanor. And I would have to say, after having lunch with her and sitting there talking, once she started talking, when we left, I knew that she had something to do with my son's death. Yes, we met several times. After that, we went back to the restaurant again. And I noticed her demeanor was different than the subsequent times that we met. She would move around a lot. She would rub her arms, she would rub her thighs, she would rub her hands through her hair, and it was kind of I would say maybe self-soothing, unless it was, could have been, some people have said that's also mannerisms people have when they're on drugs, so I'm not really sure. So we went to meet also at the bookstore at the mall in Asheboro, and my daughter was with me. We sat down at a table, and we got coffees, and we're sitting there, and Cassandra starts talking about Brandon, and she's acting like she's crying, and she is wiping tears away from her eyes like this, but she wasn't crying and there were no tears. So that was just really odd. And then she just blurts out, "I'm going to jail." And it didn't fit into any of the conversation that we had before or after. So it was just very strange. And during that same meeting, after coffee, there's a Chick-fil-A in the mall, and we were in there sitting down, and I asked to see her text, and I decided I wanted to take a photo of her last text to Brandon, because when I read it, it was just very shocking. There was a text about, she was asking him if he was in jail or had he been in a life-altering situation. And I thought, who checks on someone and says things like this? It was just very strange.
In the months ahead, Sarah would not be the only one to grow suspicious of Cassandra. Detective Jeremy Sudeth, who was investigating Brandon's death, would request an interview with Cassandra. Despite being asked to come in on November the 15th, she would find excuses to skip the interview until December the 4th. When she finally agreed to come in, her behavior was perhaps even more concerning. During the roughly 2-hour interview, Cassandra admitted that she had lied to Brandon's mom, but promised she would tell her the truth. She let Sudeth see text messages on her phone before eventually agreeing to a phone dump. When Detective Sudeth stepped out of the interview room, he watched Cassandra on the camera feed as she started messing with her phone. According to the detective's report, she began to type or do something on her phone very fast. This continued on their way to the Randolph County Sheriff's Office, where the phone dump would be completed. In the vehicle, Sudeth noticed that Cassandra was holding her phone to the steering wheel, like she was texting or working on it. Once the phone dump was completed, the detective was unable to retrieve any recent GPS data and unable to see any text messages, even though he had seen them before leaving the interview room. Sudeth was told that the data had been erased prior to the phone being hooked up to the computer. He sent a preservation request to Verizon to ensure that Cassandra's phone records were maintained. Cassandra later sent a text message describing what had happened during the interview and how she was asked about her relationship with Brandon. She would say, "I didn't find him attractive like that." The claim contradicts what she told Sarah about her relationship with Brandon.
Cassandra told me that Brandon was her soulmate. She said that she was divorced and that her and Brandon planned to have children together, that they were going to move in together. But the strange thing is that she would always say they were going to move in together and open a bank account. It was almost always those two things together, which most people, when they say, we're going to move in together, it's just that. It's not, we're going to move in together and open a bank account. So the bank account was really an important part that she kept bringing up about her relationship with Brandon.
Surprisingly, Cassandra had been married all the while. Before the interview with police, she had texted her husband things like, "I'm seriously very annoyed by this, and these mother are going to provoke a demon in me." Later, a giddy Cassandra contacts Sarah, saying she thought, "Is that it?" She went on to claim that the female detective spent a lot of time disparaging Brandon. On December the 5th or 6th, Detective Sudeth tells Sarah's husband that he believes Cassandra will confess the next time he talks to her. Police begin working to obtain a search warrant for Cassandra's phone records. On December the 26th, 2019, Detective Sudeth tells Sarah that he'll call her the next time with the results of the phone search warrant. but he'll never call and she'll never hear from him again. When Sarah's husband calls the police department on January the 6th, 2021, they learn that Detective Sudduth has been promoted, while Brandon's case has been assigned to Detective Laura Johnson, who points out that she is training and has other cases to deal with. That would change everything for Brandon's case.
I think if Sudduth had stayed on the case might have stayed open. Not really sure who makes the decisions. It was all very strange. They had taken Cassandra in for questioning. They had done search warrants on her phone. They did a search warrant on Brandon's phone. They issued search warrants in his apartment to look for items that he had been beaten with. And then it changes to he had pneumonia and beat himself. So the whole thing was very strange. There was a lot of odd behavior from Detective Johnson right from the start, even at the crime scene. On the bloodstain pattern of Brandon's head, she had placed a box over that and was standing on it, which is really contaminating the crime scene. And it just seems like anybody with common sense would know not to do something like that. And just how she continued to blame Brandon. So first she said that he was doing meth, and then she made up the story that he was doing synthetic marijuana. And she even told me that they found synthetic marijuana in his house, which once the case was closed and I could get the evidence logs, the search warrants, the items that they had taken with the search warrants, and the crime scene photos, there were no drugs. There was nothing of drugs. And it was infuriating how she handled it, but it was also, I wasn't very surprised just at how she kept trying to blame the victim, blaming the saying he took drugs when he didn't. There was nothing that existed. Even the people that were possibly involved said that Brandon wasn't taking drugs, so none of it made sense at all. But there was just something about the way Johnson handled it. When she came over to Brandon's apartment, she made a lot of disparaging remarks because his apartment had been tossed, and I knew how it looked because I had been there packing everything up in boxes. And later, I see the crime scene photos, and I was like, that, I've said Brandon was a messy guy. He wasn't super neat, but it was more of a lived in kind of thing. And I mean, we just realized even the trash can, Brandon had a full-size trash can, and that was gone. It was missing from the crime scene, along with the shower curtain for the hallway bathroom and the shower rod. So there were things that were missing from his apartment. And it looks like they had just dumped the trash out and just everywhere. And someone came up with a really good theory, and I think this makes sense, that they may have dumped the trash out to use the trash can to put stuff that could have been incriminating, to put that in the trash can to throw it away. And that makes sense to me. And Brandon's case is not the only felony case that's been swept under the rug in that department.
I read, you must, either you or somebody were on Reddit, mentioned something about that, where they had,
yes,
I think one was either rape or molestation or something.
2 rape cases of young girls by the same detective were swept under the rug. And these are only ones that I know. There could be more. I think if it gets put out, to ask people, to ask the public, there might be more cases that are like this that have been swept under the rug. They were victims too. And this police department It's one thing to leave a case open, but to victimize a victim and not even validate that they were a victim is just, I think it's damaging. It's damaging to people. But one of the things that I thought of, because so many of his clothes had been dumped out, is that they were dumping his clothing out to find stuff to put on. Maybe they didn't want to wear their own clothes if their clothes had blood, if they were wet, bloody. So I think that could have been part of it. But there were boxes that I had packed in the living room that ended up dumped out in his bedroom. So it's possible they were looking for something too.
Detective Johnson would suggest that Brandon took synthetic marijuana before beating himself to death. There were problems with that theory, since evidence logs show no illegal substances in Brandon's apartment, and toxicology tests found no illegal drugs in his system. In the mid-80s, Hobart police suspected 52-year-old James Cooley beat himself to death with a claw hammer because he was distraught about having cancer. State police eventually admitted that the man, who died from 32 hammer blows to the head, likely did not commit suicide. The feasibility of death by self-beating is easily debatable.
I have heard of people injuring themselves, but I actually Googled it, trying to find other cases where someone had beat themselves all over to the point, with the bruises, because if people look at the photos of Brandon, they will see that he was bruised all over his body, the backside, the bottoms of his feet, around his ankles, just everywhere, huge, massive bruises. So I Googled this, and no, there are no legitimate cases. There are urban legends, and that's about it, but there are no proven cases of anyone actually beating themselves to death.
On February 27, 2020, Sarah goes to the Asheboro Police Department so Detective Johnson and her colleagues can officially close the case. During the visit, they claimed there was not enough evidence to prove anything had been done to Brandon.
Luckily, I had been talking to a private investigator, and he warned me that they might be calling me in to close the case, and I'm so glad that he did, because I think that helped me prepare, but that didn't stop me from, just bringing up that none of this made sense. I kept asking about this high level of diphenhydramine, which at the time they kept calling it Benadryl. And I was like, why would he have this high level of Benadryl in his system? This doesn't make sense. Detective Johnson had called in the local SBI agent, and he was there present also. And I even brought that up to him, and he was under the impression at that time that someone could take a whole bottle of Benadryl and it wouldn't affect them, which wasn't too much longer. After that, the TikTok challenge came out with the Benadryl, and then they started publishing all the effects, which is cardiac arrest, seizures, putting people in a coma. So it's definitely a very dangerous and fatal medication, even though it's over the counter if it's taken in a high dose. I brought up how bizarre Cassandra was, and all of the stuff that I had been finding out about her, and Lori Johnson would just shrug her shoulder at me. There was a Lieutenant Wagner who worked in the criminal investigations, the SBI agent, and Johnson, and she kept leaving the room. She kept saying, I have to take this call, or something like that. And I just thought it was very strange to call parents in from a homicide investigation, and now you're closing the case, and she keeps leaving the room like that. I thought it was very strange.
While this is the official record, according to the Asheboro Police Department, Sarah Lee has conducted her own investigation in hopes of uncovering the truth and correcting the record. Her motherly intuition tells her that Brandon was the victim of foul play, and she'll do anything to prove it. Certain aspects of the case give credence to the idea that Brandon was potentially poisoned and beaten to death. Through persistence, Sarah has managed to obtain text message records, audio recordings, police reports, and more to support the theory that Brandon was murdered. She has also spent countless hours talking to witnesses and spreading information about her son's case on social media. Specific events leading up to Brandon's possible murder may be inconsequential on their own. When taken as a whole, though, it becomes more clear that there is more than meets the eye. In the months before Brandon was found badly beaten in apartment A, he had sought medical treatment multiple times due to symptoms similar to ethylene glycol poisoning. The symptoms do not begin until after January, around the time he started speaking to the mysterious Cassandra. He was first taken to the hospital by Guilford County EMS on February 18.
So after Brandon died, I started digging into more of the medical records, and I kept thinking about the first time that he had been intubated in February. And with that, he arrives at the emergency room and he goes into a coma. His central nervous system is failing. His kidneys are failing, and his respiratory system is failing. He was in ICU for 5 days, and they never came up with a diagnosis. They never really came up with a reason that this happened to him. And it was very strange. And I got over 500 pages of medical records from that one visit. And as I'm reading through this, it's just like there has to be an explanation for why his body was shutting down. And really, he had all of the makings of what would be the symptoms of antifreeze poisoning. Even the calcium oxalate crystals in his urine, that's another sign of antifreeze poisoning, and that was present. And once I started seeing that, then I thought, okay, I need to see what else is out there. So I started going through his papers. I started requesting other medical records, and I knew that he had went to the ER. So I pulled that, and it was kind of it was 2 months later. He was falling unconscious at work. They took him by ambulance. He thought he had food poisoning. And then 2 months later, he's at the urgent care. He's complaining of an ongoing headache, that he's been vomiting for about 2 months, and just these, different symptoms. They didn't know what was wrong with him. They test him for Lyme disease. Then, so that was June for urgent care. 2 months later, August, I get texts from his phone that he's just deathly ill. He's vomiting for like 2 days. And from the text, it sounded like he had went unconscious at that time. And then it's about a month later that he's, once again having these symptoms with his organs shutting down. But only this time he's beaten all over and he dies.
In the middle of August, he was trying to pack items in his apartment because he was looking for a rental in Charlotte, closer to work. He wrote, "Still feel like crap. I'm trying to get started though. When Brandon was discovered, the door was locked, but the spare key he made was missing. His wallet and keys were found in the ransacked bedroom, while the apartment key was never found. Nevertheless, there's a possibility that someone could have gained entry into the residence prior to Brandon's beating.
Okay, so she said that Brandon would leave the key for her in the gas tank of the Camaro, and she would also say that he kept the key the last time that she saw it was in the drawer of what she called the bureau, which is the dresser. And she told me this long story about going to Sam's Club and asking Brandon to leave the door unlocked and that she would lock it when she left. And I thought that, that just indicated that she had access to a key. Brandon had sent a message that February when he first went in ICU, the first time he was in ICU, he sent text. Supposedly, I go back now, every text that was sent, I think was this really Brandon. But it said that the spare key was missing. And then, one of the biggest issues with Brandon's case is that even when Brandon was in the hospital, the police were saying the door was locked and there was no forced entry. But what they didn't say was that Brandon's key to his apartment, not just the spare key, but also his key, was missing from his key ring. And they took crime scene photos of his keys, and that's where you can see the truck keys and where he would have had his door key. And it looks like the carabiner is still attached to his jeans, which were incidentally inside out. So the apartment key was missing. And, someone doesn't need to force an entry if they have the key. No, I didn't. And I even called the apartment manager because I know when we went into the apartment, well, my husband went first, I had to go to the property manager to get the key, and that was the same ones that the police used to unlock the door. And Detective Sadeth told me that Brandon's keys were on the bookshelf. So I got the keys to the bookshelf and handed them to my husband, and I never went over to Brandon's apartment alone because of what happened. And my husband kept saying that they were looking for Brandon's door key. And I really just didn't, with everything, I just didn't really put that together. But now I understand why he said, like, every key they found, they were trying it at the door. And then later, my daughter sends me photos that she had taken in Brandon's apartment because she used to go over there quite a bit. And his keys happened to be in the photo, so I could see the picture of his door key, and I knew exactly what his key looked like, and that key was not in any of the crime scene photos.
Whatever happened to Brandon might have happened in a day or days before the discovery. Several people had called and visited Brandon without getting a response. On September the 8th, he had ordered pizza for nearly $36, which would be enough for 2 people. The pizza box was still in the apartment when police were there. On September the 10th, around 11:30 a.m., Brandon's card was used at a local Adam and Eve adult store to purchase more than $20 in merchandise. His card was also used to purchase 1728 at the Jade Express at the Randolph Mall. On the 11th, a neighbor saw FedEx try to deliver something to Brandon's apartment, but he didn't answer, and Cassandra told Sarah that he was expecting a package. A job recruiter had called Brandon on the 11th and 12th, but again, there was no answer. A pair of handcuffs and a bra were located in the apartment, suggesting a woman could have been there with him. Conversations between Cassandra and Sarah also raised suspicion that someone in particular was possibly with Brandon when he was severely beaten. The last verified answered call to Brandon's phone occurred on September the 10th at 9:26 p.m. from a girl from Virginia named Olivia, who had also been talking to Brandon before his death. The call lasted for 13 minutes. When Olivia tried to call again on September the 11th at 1:30 p.m., there was no answer. Brandon's mom speculates that whoever was on the phone for those 13 minutes was not her son.
Well, when we first found out about the phone call, honestly, as a mother, I wanted Brandon to have suffered as little as possible. So I really wasn't going back and analyzing that or to see if it had been true. I was just desperately looking for this timeline. But then when I started going back and I was comparing my phone calls when I was trying to get a hold of Brandon and wondering why he didn't call me, I had called him at 8 o'clock, and supposedly she talked to him at 9:30, but then I called again at 10 o'clock and he never responded or answered my calls. Now, if he had been home, like she said, and talking and everything, he would have called me back or he would have sent me a text, and there was no response from him. Nobody had heard from him in days. So once I started looking back at things, I thought, no, I don't think that was him on the call. And what really sealed that in was going back to the text that was sent on Monday when it said that his head was hurting. There was something that was said, and I read these texts out loud to my husband, and he's actually the one that noticed it. And when I read it, the grammar was off. It was definitely something that not how Brandon would talk. And my husband just made a face, and I was like, oh my goodness, you're right. That wasn't Brandon that sent that text. And from there, we knew, okay, he was already unconscious by Monday because he was not sending those texts from his phone.
Besides the apartment key, another item was missing from the apartment, which causes further concern. As a member of the Navy, Brandon had dog tags with his social security number on them. They were very important to him. Although it was the thing he never took off, the dog tags were missing.
No, we didn't find his dog tags. Cassandra kept telling me that I really needed to find his dog tags, that I needed to ask the police about his dog tags. She sent several messages about the dog tags, and I did think that was really odd that they wouldn't be there. Dog tags have so much personal information. They have your social security number on them with your name, and so it's not just something that you can get rid of. Nobody really does that. They usually, hold on to them. And later, we will get in touch with Cassandra's ex-boyfriend and then also her husband, and he tells me that there was a pair of dog tags on Cassandra's bed, that he had actually picked them up and wondered whose they were and put them back down. So I believe she had the dog tags the whole time. Yes. Cassandra said that she would call AT&T to get phone records. She would also say that she was going to call the hospital and tell them that she was his wife and get his phone records. She was just very bold to, to make any kind of phone call and demand personal papers. I was really taken aback by that. Right from the beginning, how she said that she would call these people, and she said that she had his bank pin written down somewhere, on a Post-it. She said that she had his VA paperwork because she was going to help him with some things for his VA. And that was another thing that was missing. We found one copy of his DD-214. It was bloody. It looked stepped on. I think there's like a footprint on the back of it. And there should have been many copies of his DD-214 and just missing. I do. I think she had the dog tags, and she had come back to South Carolina just for a quick trip to change vehicles. And she talked about getting her things. And she had got some things out of her closet, very, like, minimal. She didn't take any of her clothes. Didn't look like she'd take any shoes or anything like that. But I think at that time, maybe she took the dog tags and any other trophies she might have had. I think the biggest one was saying that she was divorced. She told me one time, she was on the phone with me, and she said, that's my ex-husband. He's here getting my mail for me. And it was actually her husband who was coming home from work getting the mail, and it was always very strange. Like, she would tell me that she was at work, but you could hear she was driving in her car. She told me that she worked as a nurse. No one can find any kind of nursing license on her. She told me that she worked in a domestic violence center as a nurse, and then she said that she changed jobs and she worked in a prison as a nurse. She said that her mom and her dad were in prison. She said that she was Russian, from Russia. She had also told Brandon that she was Russian and going back to Russia. It seemed to be like when Brandon would get sick, she would have a story that she was going to disappear, go to Russia. She said that she had like lots of brothers and sisters. I think she only has like one sister. Just endless lies, just a pathological liar. But I think a lot of the lying centered around her trying to cover her tracks.
Witnesses said they saw a man arguing with Brandon in front of his apartment a few days before the ambulance came. The man was described as short, in his 30s, with dark hair and glasses.
So I thought that was so strange because Brandon was not an argumentative type of person, especially not like arguing with someone out in public. So the whole thing was just extremely strange to me. I just couldn't imagine Brandon arguing with someone. So I kept bringing it up, and I did even ask, I said, could it have been the maintenance man? At first, that's what I thought, was it like a misunderstanding? But then I thought, well, the witness lived in that apartment, so the witness would know what the maintenance man looked like, So I was just trying to find some kind of explanation because it just wasn't like Brandon to argue with anyone like that. But I keep talking to the witness, and then they tell me, they actually give me a description of the man. And later, my daughter will get a text message, not a text message, I'm sorry. My daughter will get a message on Facebook Messenger that says, "I killed your brother." And it was from this account. And the account was named Larry Weeds, which was like probably a fake name. But the description of that man fit the man that had been at Brandon's apartment. And it was just something that the police never tried to identify who was there, who was he talking to, who was he having an argument with. And then, I do end up talking to maintenance, and he didn't fit the description at all. The description was the man had dark hair, and I asked the maintenance man about that, like if he could have been mistaken. And he was like, well, I don't have hair. And then, that was one of the things in Lori Johnson's report that she mentioned. She talked to maintenance and asked if he had seen anyone coming or going in Brandon's apartment. And he said no. And it's like I don't know, like, okay, that if her attitude was, okay, that solves it because no one was coming or going. But when you see the apartment community, it's pretty expansive. I mean, there are several buildings that go down the street and on the backside of the street. There's, and that only would cover, maintenance if they had been at that complex. If they had been at Brandon's apartment, could they have seen anything?
Sometimes the company you keep can tell you a lot about someone.
So Cassandra did tell me that she was going to the prison, she said, as a nurse, and she said that she had special patients that only she could take care of. Later, I find out that the person that she would go see in prison was someone she considered herself engaged to. So she considered herself engaged to my son, considered herself engaged to this man in prison, while she was married. And it wasn't like she really, they weren't separated or anything. She lived with her husband the whole time. They would be texting about what they were going to have for dinner and things like that. But the man in prison is Wade Hoover. He's in a federal prison for raping boys that were in his martial arts school. And then also he's in federal prison for the distribution of filming it, so for child pornography. Okay. Cassandra also has another person in prison that she corresponds with, and that is Michael McNaughton, and he is in for a violent murder that it just seems like, the more I read about it, it just seems like McNaughton just really wanted to murder someone. He stabbed someone with a screwdriver in the back of the neck and then strangled them like 7 times, he said, because the person wouldn't die, so he just kept strangling them with a garrote.
Brandon's mom believes her son might have been poisoned and beaten. This idea is supported by the fact that Brandon had been sick in the months before his death. Oddly, he isn't the only one who'd been getting ill around this time, and some of those experiencing illnesses had also encountered Cassandra.
Then Cassandra told me something that really just made me start looking at her more as a person that is like a psychopath. Aside from the pathological lying, she said that she had 13 friends or 12 friends that had died, and when her other friend Dee Dee dies, that will make 13 friends. So she told me she had this friend that was very sick, and a female that lived in the Asheboro area, and we later find out that there was someone named Dee Dee, the nickname of Dee Dee, who died 4 days after Brandon, and just under very mysterious circumstances, they ruled it a suicide, but it was with cold medicine. So I just find that similarity of the Benadryl, the diphenhydramine that was in my son's system, and then this female that Cassandra had said the name of, and she dies of cold medicine. And I also later find text going back for years where Cassandra's having her husband buy just copious amounts of NyQuil and diphenhydramine sleep aids. Cassandra also mentioned a friend named Louise, and we did find a Louise that she possibly worked with at the IHOP in Florence, South Carolina, and we started having stomach issues, and they said that she died of stomach issues. Brandon, Dee Dee, and Louise all died right around their birthday, within a day or two of their birthday. You know, it's not my job to investigate all of these things, but I think that there's just so much that keeps coming up with Cassandra that it deserves a legitimate investigation by people with the proper authority and, you know, who have the ability to get the information and to ask the right questions. Because I'm very limited, and you know, but it's the more I dig, the more strange things that come up about her, and the more questions are raised. That for her to be so young, there are a lot of dead people in her path.
Despite these coincidences, Brandon's case was closed without a thorough investigation. If Brandon was indeed murdered, someone out there knows who did it, and that individual can now be looking for new victims. The predator may have new prey locked in their crosshairs as they continue spinning their web. Brandon's family deserves answers, and at the very least a comprehensive investigation instead of an open and shut case on a whim.
I think Brandon was drugged because he was such a strong guy. He was just incredibly strong. And so I think he was subdued. I think he was restrained. I think the markings on his wrists and the bruising going around his ankles show that there was restraint, possibly even restraints around his body, because if you look at the bruising, there's some very symmetrical bruising like going around his chest, and both females kind of mentioned this. Cassandra knew about the bruising going around Brandon's chest when no one else did. It wasn't even annotated in the autopsy or in the medical records, but then you can see it. He had a hospital gown on when I saw him, but she knew about this bruising. His toes are bruised, his hands are bruised. It's possible he could have had broken fingers or toes. Like I said, to me, it looks like he was tortured. There was very strange bruising in his mouth. His mouth was just black with bruising. I just cannot imagine what was going on or what all had happened to him, but there was just bruising everywhere. Without legal action, I don't think that Asheboro Police Department will reopen Brandon's case. I would like to see a higher authority take a look at Brandon's case, because I just have felt that that the detectives did everything they could to not investigate, and I think that alone deserves an investigation of what is this police department doing? Why are they covering up these crimes? So I would like to see another authority look into Brandon's case, and also into any other deaths that could be connected to what happened to Brandon. No, I won't. I will keep working. There is no statute of limitations on a homicide, so I will just keep working and keep trying to put things together. And I know it's very slow. It's been 3 years at this point, but I will often, I have to say that from not knowing from the moment in the hospital, like what happened here, just having no idea why he looked that way or what could have happened, to knowing everything that we have found out at this point, it's still a lot. I mean, there's still a lot of questions. I keep saying it's like putting a puzzle together, and you get a piece of the puzzle, but then the puzzle gets bigger. So, at this point, I will just keep working for justice and trying to get answers. And there's a lot on the list to do, but it's hard. I'm one person. I'm just a mom, so
Yeah.
it's a lot of work.
Yeah, I bet.
It's a lot for me, and I still have things that to get done. And one of the major thing is getting the autopsy review. But I will say that the autopsy was changed. So when they closed the case, I don't think that they were even aware that the medical examiner had changed the autopsy to undetermined. And with an undetermined autopsy, they really should not have closed the case. I think they should have left it open just from that alone. I think having answers would finally give us some peace. It's like our grieving process is interrupted because we've had to work so hard. We're doing the job of the police department. We're doing what they should be doing. My job was to, of course, take anything that I knew or anything that was suspicious and bring it to their attention, which I did. But then it was their job to investigate. And then it was my job to honor my son, to grieve my son, and, to have remembrance for him. But this happens sometimes. Sadly, there's, it's not just my son's case. There are many cases that end up like this, and it is a lot to be put on the parents. Yes, I do. I feel like Cassandra is a young person. She has a lot of years ahead of her, and knowing her history, and even herself saying that she has 13 friends that died in 2.5 years, and seeing that my son, her husband, and ex-boyfriend were all sick and all had these symptoms when they were with her. I definitely think that people could be in danger. One of the places that I've put most of the just information, evidence, things like that is on Brandon's Facebook page, which is Brandon's Voice, the Murder and Cover-Up of Brandon Embry. I've also done TikToks, and I try to hit all the social media, but it just seems like Facebook has been just the easiest place to kind of document everything. And there's also many, there's YouTube's podcasts that are very informative.